So this is our series of Meet the Rabbis, um, and with the exception of Rabbi Papo that we talked about last month, I've had the distinct pleasure of either meeting directly or secondhand the other three rabbis beginning today. And as I start with the biography of Rabbi Freehoff, and I'll explain when I was able to actually meet him and be inspired by him. Solomon Benedict Freehoff, um, was born in London, 1892, came to the United States when he was 11, was first living in Baltimore, and then his whole family, I guess, moved with him when he enrolled at the University of Cincinnati in which at the time, around 1910, the program was for rabbinic students was a combined bachelor's degree from the University of Cincinnati, as well as the rabbinic ordination through the Hebrew Union College. That's all it was called in those days. Founded in 1875, but in the early 1900s, it was just the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Then that merged with the Jewish Institute of Religion in 1951. But earlier in the days, the program actually started with selected students who were had not yet graduated high school, and they were accepted into a program as early as age 15, which was a combined, like I said, University of Cincinnati baccalaureate degree as well as rabbinic ordination. So Freehoff was ordained in 1915 at age 22. He was invited to join the faculty for a few years, but World War I intervened, and he served as a chaplain for American Expeditionary Forces in Europe during World War One. When the war was over, he came back to the States, moved to Chicago, and was in one of the downtown major congregations there. And then in 1934, soon after marrying his wife Lillian, who was a Jewish educator in her own right, they moved to Pittsburgh. He accepted the position or responded to the call to serve as senior rabbi of Rodef Sholom congregation, the main Reform congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he served his entire career then. Lillian published children's books for Sunday schools, for religious schools, and those of us who grew up at least part of the time attending reform-oriented supplementary Jewish education remember the Lillian Freehoff textbooks from about second and third grade earlier on. Freehoff had an interesting, in addition to all that we're talking about with his scholarship, he had an interesting hobby in that he would bind his own books and he would rebind books that were falling apart. That was his hobby. That's what when he wanted his own private time, relaxing time, sanctuary time, recreation time. That's what he wound up doing. Is he would rebind or rebind, I guess, books had his own bindery, and they gave him, in addition to his library, which overflowed the rabbinic to the rabbi study at the congregation in Pittsburgh. So they also gave him extra space for all of his books, but they also gave him a small room that he could use as a bindery. if you will. Um, so historically, biographically, that's what it is. He served until I think the middle of the 1980s. Officially, he was still active into his 80s, serving as the congregation. He was the rabbi emeritus, a senior scholar, um, and he was writing and teaching with the kind of literature that I'm going to be talking about in a few moments. When I mentioned that I had the special opportunity to meet him and to be inspired by him, of course, we all rabbinic students, certainly into the 60s and 70s, already knew of his scholarship and his leadership in the realm of Jewish literature that we call responsa, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. uh, he was still functioning as the assistant, as the rabbi emeritus of Road of Shalom congregation in Pittsburgh. And one of my friend's classmates at rabbinic school in 1975 was called to be the assistant rabbi at Road of Shalom in Pittsburgh, and he invited a bunch of us to come for his installation, Shabbat and weekend, because Rabbi Freehoff, who was retired, he was no longer the senior rabbi. Walter Jacob was the senior rabbi, but my colleague and classmate Mark Stateman was going to be installed, and Rabbi Freehoff was going to teach a class in honor of Rabbi Stateman coming as the new assistant rabbi, and was going to teach a private session for all of Rabbi Stateman's friends and colleagues who would come to Pittsburgh for the event. Pittsburgh wasn't too far from Cleveland, where I was serving as a rabbi already at the time, so it was an easy drive to go down for the day, celebrate with Rabbi Stateman, and hear Rabbi Freehoff talk. And I kept a copy of a written transcript of what he said, and I want to share one quote because this was his life. This is what he taught, and what I try to incorporate in my rabbinate as well, which is why I include Freehoff as one of the rabbi's rabbis. Quote: I'm struggling for a philosophy which will allow us to have a kinship with the greatness of the Jewish spirit. The problem is how to have both loyalty to it and freedom from it. Okay, so that's Freehoff's very, very honest approach. That it's a struggle. It's a struggle to maintain your loyalty to the traditions of Judaism, what he called the greatness of the Jewish spirit, and also to have personal and community freedom to be the kind of congregation or community or the kind of individual Jew which we might want to be. So Freehoff gave a talk, led a class in honor of Rabbi Stateman in 1975, and I was privileged to meet him and learn from him at that point. So let me set the stage, really, because there are two parts to what I want to talk about with Rabbi Freehoff and his scholarship and his leadership. Um, the first is um, this area of responsa that I mentioned earlier, and I'll come back to that. The second is the whole understanding of Reform Judaism as it develops in especially in North America, as of the end of the 19th century and taking it up to the present day. So we'll do the response literature first, and then I'll come more to an explanation of what Reform Judaism has meant to North America and the movements and the organization. I don't mean institutionally, but the way that the movement has impacted and me, and influenced me, and provided me with the motivation to do what I do, and also the impact that it's had on the American Jewish world, if not the entire Jewish world. Okay, so with a great deal of respect, um, we need to look at again what we call responsa literature. Respond, to respond. In the Aramaic, in earlier Jewish literature, it's called in Aramaic shakla v'taria. In Hebrew, it would be she'elot utshuvot, questions and answers. And here's an example that Freehoff himself uses in the introduction to one of his books. Okay, one of the first questions that I was asked when he was serving as a military chaplain in World War II. He was a military chaplain as well. So the question: if there are Jewish servicemen who are stationed in Iceland, where nighttime can be 6 months long. Okay? Now, this is long before we used to ask the question, like with the astronauts, what do we do with a Jewish astronaut? Can you see him putting on tefillin, every 20 minutes when goes around the world? But so Freehoff, as the leading rabbi or the leading rabbinic scholar of the World War II era Jewish chaplains, was asked the question: in Iceland, if there are Jewish servicemen in Iceland, where nighttime can be 6 months long, when is sunset? So whether it's for lighting Shabbos candles, whether it's for starting a holiday, whether it's for ending the Shabbat, what Havdalah, whatever it is, how do you know when it's sunset? You're obviously not going to have a 6 month long Shabbat. And his answer, again, looking into the tradition, looking into all of the various tomes and volumes that the rabbis through the centuries have given, including responsa literature, questions and answers, going back 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 years. His answer was that for the Jewish servicemen, they should follow the time frame of the largest Jewish community in the world, which was at the time, which was New York City. So his answer was that they should follow the same time frame, lighting candles, ending Shabbat, starting the holiday, whatever it might be, as in New York City. He later on, after the end of World War II, and then after 1948, probably in about 1952, I think, he changed it to servicemen in a situation like this can have the choice of following the timelines as it is in New York City or in Jerusalem. So he did modify that just a little bit, but it might be trivial to some of us. It might be kind of the question that we would smile when thinking about, but it indicates um, uh, the necessity to seriously answer questions that Jewish people might have about how to observe, how to practice, how for a congregation, for a community, someone who, whether it's the rabbi, whether it's an individual person. Most of you have heard the example that I give about wearing a yarmulke. When we look back into the literature, the earliest reference that we have in a responsum, this is long before Freehoff, long before Norm Roman, whatever, going back to about the 800s. An isolated Jewish community sends a letter to a number of rabbis in Europe, in the Mediterranean area, saying a member of our community realized that he said his prayers with his head covered. Okay. Are his prayers still valid? Or should, if that happens again, because obviously it took like probably a year for them to get the answer. But if this should happen again, does he have to take it, uncover his head and recite the prayers all over again? Or is it still valid for Jewish prayers to be recited if the head is covered? And the answer, when it did come from those rabbis, back to this island, and I'm blanking on the name of the island at this point. There was a small Jewish community near Crete or something, Rhodes. The answer was yes, your prayers are still valid if your head is covered, which certainly leads us to believe that at least at that time, it was not the practice to wear a kippah. So somewhere between 800 and more modern times, let's say, the tradition changed. Aha, changed. Let's use the word reformed. Change, reform in response to people's needs, societies, mores and definitions, whatever, has always been a hallmark of Jewish practice and even Jewish tradition, contrary to what most Orthodox and certainly ultra Orthodox would proclaim. Their statement would be in contradiction to what I'm saying, that change and reform has always been part of Jewish tradition. They would say yes, there has been change and reform, but only up to a certain time. At a certain time in history, guess who? The rabbis decided, Genug, Dayenu, no more. No more change, no more reform. This is Tevye's word. This is tradition. Don't ask me why we do it. This is the way that we do it, whether we have a scholarly justification for it or not. This is the tradition. No more change. Um, Needless to say, as a little bit of a sidebar, needless to say, that situation is being challenged even in the Orthodox communities these days. Uh, so whether it's the role of women, whether it's understanding who is a Jew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's go back to Freehoff and this the role of responsa. Um, uh, it's fair to say that Freehoff was probably one of, if not the most influential Reform rabbis in the United States or North America, who moved the movement or the institutions of Reform Judaism away from classical reform, which I'll talk about in part two of today's class, moved away from classical towards an appreciation. And again, that's Freehoff's word, an appreciation of traditional practices. He didn't so much advocate that American Jews, and if I can say American, meaning North American, Canada as well, that American Jews, he didn't advocate returning to traditional rituals, um, uh, and customs and ceremonies and practices, whether it's keeping kosher, whatever. He didn't so much advocate returning to those rituals as demonstrating that the way Jews in North America or in the modern world, let's say, that their practices were just as authentic as the traditional words. He wasn't out to denigrate or deny or criticize traditional practice, so much as to say that the new practices or the reformed, with a small r, the reformed practices of the North American Jewish community or the British Jewish community or the South African or Australian or wherever it might be, this is pre-Israel, that those practices were authentic. If anything, he spoke most critically against those Reform Jews, those Reform rabbis, and those institutions who were totally denying and totally rejecting early. I'm sorry, who were totally rejecting traditional Jewish practice, and that's the second part of what I want to talk about. He wanted Reform Judaism, and again, if we're talking about early 20th century, we're talking about 100 years ago. Um, ref, we the American Jewish community really didn't divide itself into Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, whatever. It was American Judaism. What did American Judaism look like as compared to Eastern Europe, the Judaism of the shtetl, for example? Freehoff felt that American ritual, ceremony, religious life should be respectful of the values and the ethical insights of traditional Jewish practice of halacha, but that, and this is his phrase, a very famous phrase, is the halacha and Jewish practice should be for guidance, not governance. In other words, we should be guided by the values, and we talked about the values, the midot, when we were talking Musar with Rabbi Papo a month ago. That we should include the respectfully and try to understand educationally and spiritually where those ceremonies and rituals may have come from, but we're not bound to them. We're not bound to them. We study them, we respond to them, and ideally, just as early Jewish law, halacha, in order to be, what's the best word, kosher, valid, in order to be true Jewish law, it has to originally be based on a what we call a proof text. They have to be able to cite a text or a quote, preferably from the Torah. But if not from the Torah, it could be from the Tanakh, from the Bible itself. If you couldn't find some kind of a proof text that would trace itself back to Moses, if not God and God's word, then it couldn't claim to be part of halacha. Then it became part of, again, Tevye's world, tradition, custom, ceremony. Why do we do it? I don't know, but it's a tradition. Okay. And many of those traditions we know took on the force of law, even though it didn't have the proof text, so to speak. What Freehoff was saying, using the same process, was that in order for a, again, reform, but not with a capital R, in order for American type of modern reformed Judaism to be authentic, you still had to be able to find rationale for it within Jewish tradition, Jewish thinking, Jewish literature. May not be a proof text from the Torah, most likely it wasn't from the Torah, but it may have been from a decision like the rabbis who answered the people who wrote the letter from Crete or Rhodes or wherever it was, from the writing of some of the rabbis in the 8th, 9th, 10th century, the Maimonides, Rashi, biblical commentator, but others, Ibn Ezra, and who may have had different interpretations than the normative halachic traditional understanding. So he felt and he taught and he wrote his books on the premise that a knowledgeable scholarly rabbi like himself, and I'm not trying to say that he was egotistical, but he was certainly confident of his knowledge, that he could interpret tradition in light of modernity, or what was for him that was modern. So he would write responsa. Questions would come from rabbis and from lay people all over North America, if not even all over the world. And he would write individual rulings based, this is a quote, individual rulings based on legal precedent in response to questions about real life situations for Jews of the 20th century. He first started doing this. I mentioned it, a chaplain in World War II, but in a recognized form where his answers were published and disseminated around the country or around the continent. In 1956, he was appointed as the chairman of a new committee, the Responsa Committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the rabbinic guild organization of Reform rabbis as of 1956. And since from 56 until the 1980s, he published no less than 8 volumes of responsive, personally answering all of these individual questions. Thousands of answers and articles of how Jews could, but he emphasized how Jews could, not should. He wasn't mandating, he wasn't instructing, he was guiding. Okay, that Jewish tradition can give you the following response. And I have to jump back in a moment to a different conversation that I shared with people. I don't remember. Gail may have been involved in this a couple of years ago when I first came here. So Freehoff giving again guidance, not an answer of what should or must be done. This is the way, but what could be done and how we could reconcile a problem of modern Jewish life, living in the diaspora, living in a free society like we are, with Jewish tradition. The most obvious examples being mixed marriage. Okay, Jewish tradition had a very, very, very specific, this is a no-no. Okay, Jews don't marry non-Jews, etc. Okay, new questions about who is a Jew. Okay, most people think, well, the old answer was you're Jewish if your mother was Jewish. That wasn't always the case. And Freehoff did several articles and responses proving that that wasn't always the case in Jewish tradition. And therefore, new definitions of who could be considered Jewish, at least for the liberal Jewish world, were indeed possible. Something that was new to our generation and living here in a free society, and I dealt with it many times in my years as a congregational rabbi. What is the role that a non-Jewish spouse can play in the synagogue, in a life cycle ceremony, in a bar bat mitzvah, or at a wedding? What role does the non-Jewish partner, spouse, or child or sibling play in a technically Jewish ceremony? Can a non-Jew recite the Torah blessings? Can a non-Jew light the Shabbos candles for the congregation? Things like that. Those were questions that never would have been asked until the last maybe 120 years. What is the process of conversion in our modern Jewish world? as opposed to what it was traditionally. Now, again, I said I have to kind of diverge from one session or one part of the discussion. This word respond. Um, One of Freehoff's students was one of my professors by the name of Alvin Reines. Reines was a professor of philosophy, and he was a scholar of Maimonides at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. But Reines developed his own philosophical interpretation of the Jewish world, where uh, where he was even concerned about Freehoff's imposition of guidance that the Jewish world needed the guidance of tradition, if not the governance. And Reines developed what he called polidoxy, that the modern Jewish world, it wasn't Orthodox, wasn't conservative, wasn't Reform, but kind of a mishmash of all of this, um, and that it was life itself and the values which we, not the spiritual values, but the values by which we live our lives, love, truth, respect, kindness, that those were the most important values, no matter how we practiced our Jewish ceremonial lives. Um, and so Reines, it was like, if you want an A in my course, the only way, you have to come to class every day and listen to my lectures. But you want an A in my course, you have to always promise that you will always remember my definition of religion. Okay. Uh, so here it is, because I got my A's. All right. Religion comes along to provide responses, not answers, but responses to those questions of life or those challenges in life that science cannot provide answers to. So if there are things that the questions we can't answer, there are predicaments, there are uh, conditions and experiences that we just don't understand. Religion steps in. Science can't give us an answer to this. Mathematics can't give us an answer to this. Biology can't give us geology, astronomy, whatever it is. If there's something that the sciences, the disciplines, the answers that they give don't satisfy us, then we look to religion to provide those responses to help us live our lives in light of those unanswerable questions, conditions, experiences. Okay. Um, and although the word appears more often in Christian thinking than it does in Jewish thinking, what Reines says is, when you have found a particular religion or set of responses that that are meaningful for you, that are relevant for you, then that's quote unquote, that's salvation. In Hebrew, it's Yeshua, but in the Christian world, it's salvation. If you're, then you're saved. Okay, that's how you find meaning in life. So Reines, who was the student of Freehoff, diverts entirely. Freehoff says no, religion, especially Jewish religion, is to provide guidance, but let's make sure that the guidance that we're giving comes from a background of Jewish thinking and Jewish literature. Reines would say no, it's all philosophical in how you think and how you want to choose to believe, because no one can question your personal beliefs if indeed science and the other disciplines don't provide answers for you. Okay, so I just wanted to give that little sidebar, if you will. Over the years, I've taught a number of classes about responsa, and where they how Freehoff develops his answer, or those who since Freehoff's death, or at least since he stopped writing the responsa, how they've followed through in the process. I did some research because one of my favorite professors at HUC, who was a Holocaust survivor, he had been one of the Talmud teachers at the Hochschule in Berlin. He along with several other scholars were brought out of Berlin in the mid to late 1930s, so they escaped. But Alexander Gutmann, who was the professor, tried to collect as many responsa as he could that were being written in the concentration camps, in the barracks. So, and I helped with some translation of that, and it's a fascinating but also a horrifying body of literature. I remember one, a man asks the rabbi in the camp. He says the guard gives me gave me a piece of bread, or a bite of bread, because it wasn't a piece of like the slice of a loaf. It was a little morsel of bread, but because my son talked back to him, he didn't get his morsel of bread. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to eat the bread and my son go hungry? Am I supposed to give it to my son and I go hungry? Am I supposed to share it? And we hope that the small morsel of bread will be enough to sustain both of us, kind of thing. And the rabbi gives a very, very serious, lengthy discourse based on some episodes that he remembered by heart, that he remembered from the Talmud. And what happens of people in two people in the desert, they only have enough water, and stuff like that. But even in the concentration camp, even in the concentration camp, there was devotion to trying to find, what am I supposed to do in this case? Okay, because it bothers me. I want to make sure that I'm doing it in the appropriate Jewish way. That wasn't necessarily the case with the responsa that Freehoff would be writing. Freehoff would be writing for, not so much for individuals, but for communities, congregations, temples. They didn't use the word synagogues as much in those days. Um, for rabbis, what do I tell my congregation? How should I decide, what to do? Whatever. Here's our need. How should we try to fulfill the need? So I just wrote down a couple examples, that are the famous ones. Because there was this great accusation, um, about a number of things, and there's generalization, and there's criticism that really comes out of ignorance rather than anything else. For example, early reform, what we call classical reform, and I'll talk about that again in a few minutes. Um, Classical reform in Europe, but also in America, trying to uh, find the right balance between tradition and modernity. So, the question was, or what we find is that many of the larger congregations started having their main, call it, say, primary worship service for the weekend. They wound up having it on Sunday morning. I mean, I'm familiar with that, certainly in Cleveland, in Detroit. Lynn's nodding her head. I mean, Silver's Temple in Cleveland. It was you had to get a ticket for a regular Sunday morning service, not just for the high holidays. You had to get tickets because of his world famous sermons that were given on Sunday morning. So the question comes: wait a minute, from the traditional community. Wait a minute, Jewish Shabbat is Friday night and Saturday. What is this whole thing about having a Sunday morning service? Yes, now some of those temples didn't have a Friday night or didn't have a Saturday. Most of them didn't have a Saturday morning. They may have had a Friday night, but Sunday became their major service. And so they were saying, well, how is this okay? Is it okay to have our service? And Freehoff's answer is very straightforward. Is it just Jewish law obviously says you're supposed to be having services 3 times a day. Not just Sunday morning. You're supposed to have afternoon and evening also. So of course you can have a Sunday morning service, and you can't. There's Jewish law, Jewish tradition says you read the Torah on Saturday morning, on Shabbat morning, and on Monday morning, and on Thursday morning. Why Monday and Thursday? Because those were the market days, and those are the days that everyone came into town and was available to listen to the Torah being read and whatever. But nowhere does it say that you can't read it on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Sunday. It just traditionally we've read it on Monday and Thursday. You want to choose to have a major public reading on Sunday? There's nothing in the law that says you can't. Okay, so he says the one thing that you shouldn't do, however, so that it's not misunderstood, doesn't mean that a lot of rabbis, including Abba Hillel Silver and Barnett Brickner and Benedict Glaser in Detroit, and what doesn't mean that they followed along with Freehoff's recommendation, but he said just don't call it a Sabbath service. Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. Don't exploit and don't denigrate the Christian's Sabbath for the sake of what is comfortable for you. We are going to have a Sunday morning service, a weekday service, whatever. We are going to have a major sermon. We're going to read from the Torah. That's all fine. Just don't call it Shabbat. Well, they didn't use the word Shabbat. They didn't use Hebrew. It would have been don't call it Sabbath. So that's the way that he would cite all kinds of all kinds of rulings and whatever to show that this interpretation was authentic within traditional Jewish practice. Because recognizing he's he's not saying it's okay for Jews to work on Friday night, Saturday, but recognizing that many Jews do work on Friday night, Saturday, or that they must work in order to keep their jobs or their business to be profitable. They have to work on Friday night or Saturday. So Freehoff is saying, I wish that weren't the case, but it is the case here in our world. So therefore, which is the higher goal, or we want to phrase it in the negative, which is the lesser evil. But at least if you can't come to temple on Friday night or Saturday, then definitely come on Sunday. Better that than not offering Sunday and not having people come at all. For example, okay. In 1904, the CCAR, the rabbis said, we recognize the historical importance of the Sabbath, but it cannot be denied that many aren't able to attend services on Shabbat or on Friday night or Saturday. So Freehoff's answer, there is nothing in the spirit of Judaism to prevent divine worship on Sunday or any other weekday if people feel it necessary. So within the context of Jewish practice, he's validating what the New World has made it necessary to be part. Another example is most people, certainly until the 1960s, most people in North America, most Jews, and here I even include the Orthodox, did not understand Hebrew. They might read their prayers in Hebrew, they might recite the prayers in Hebrew by rote, by memory, but they certainly didn't understand the Hebrew. But the tradition, or in some places, or Yiddish, but the tradition was that all the prayers and all the teaching would be in Hebrew, or in some places, not everywhere. In some places, it might be in Yiddish, um, but they needed a statement that said it's okay for these Sunday services, for example, or whenever they were having services, to be in the vernacular, which now in North America was going to be English, but it also back in the 1860s, 1870s might have been in German or in Polish or in, well, not so much in Russian, or in Italian or French or whatever the vernacular might have been. Not only the prayers, but also what about translating, interpreting the Torah reading? The Torah had to be read in Hebrew, and even there are some who said that certain of the prayers had to be recited in in Hebrew. I mean, I remember again going back into the 1950s that in some of these classical congregations, basically the Shema was the only thing that was said in Hebrew. Okay? Everything else was in English. But Freehoff did all this research and wrote a number of responsa, basically saying, listen, there are a couple things to keep in mind. Here I'm going to cite from the Talmud, where they talked about the individual who would stand next to the Torah reader. Now, if you picture the Torah being read up on the bima, in our day there's usually what we call the gabbai, or somebody who is following along in a text to make sure that the Torah reader is not making any mistakes. But there also, in ancient days, there also was someone who was called the miturgaman, the translator, who would translate, whether it was verse by verse, the way that I do it when I read Torah, or whether it was paragraph by paragraph, someone who would translate into the vernacular of the day, which was Aramaic. The congregation didn't understand the Hebrew. They could pick out a few words here and there, but the Maturgaman would translate, and we know would also do some interpreting, some commentary. Maybe there was a term, maybe there was a word that people didn't really understand because it was no longer part of their lives or their vocabulary or their experience. So the Maturgaman would not only translate the word for word, sorry for the redundancy, translate word for word, but would also, as here's an example of da 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 da, and might do a little bit more than just translating from Hebrew into Aramaic. So Freehoff would cite that as justification that it was okay, if the Torah was being read in Hebrew, it was okay to have someone else then translate it, if not even comment and interpret it for the congregation at the same time, because they didn't understand the Hebrew. And it was better educationally, and he would say spiritually, it was better for people to understand it rather than just the mitzvah of hearing it read in Hebrew. There was more to just listening to the words, than there was more than just listening to the words, was being able to assimilate and understand the words of that. Freehoff would also cite from the Mishnah and the Talmud, where there were exact quotations that say that the Shema, even the Shema, the what they call the Shemona Esrei, the tefillah, central part of the service, and Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals, could be recited in the vernacular. Preferable to say them in Hebrew, but if you didn't know them in Hebrew, you were certainly well better to say them in the vernacular language than not say them at all. As late as Maimonides and other codifiers of Jewish law all agree in writing, it's there. And Freehoff would research it and then would cite it and say, this proves that it's okay should you choose to do it. Not saying that this is what you should do, but should you choose to do it, it's okay to do these, to read the Torah and have your prayers said in the vernacular, for example. Then he also has a lot of a lot of response that especially deal with the new world's attitudes and requirements, and the exigencies of what we mentioned about who's a Jew and marriage and divorce and things like that, but also especially in times of death, death and grieving and mourning and burial. Burial was a big thing because obviously Jewish law that's developed out of biblical time and developed specifically in a part of the world where most Jews were no longer living, and the where you would bury and how you would bury and how quickly you have to bury and all of those issues were totally different in where 90% or more of the Jewish world was living compared to where and when the laws or the customs had developed. Um, so some of Freehoff's most famous responsa deal with the practical but very important questions that people were asking or rabbis were asking. Um, for example, with who can recite Kaddish? Now, you might know that according to traditional Jewish law, there's a list of the definition of who in the family who's considered a mourner and who must sit Shiva, who must participate in the mourning practices. The question is whether others can choose to do so or whether they're forbidden to do so. And that's a big debate in traditional Jewish law. There's this list of whether you can or you can't. And I remember having the discussion when some of you know that we lost a child to cancer as a teenager. The other day would have been his birthday, but when Justin died, and he was my stepson, so the Jewish law doesn't address the issue of whether a stepfather can say Kaddish for a stepchild. It's moot. It just doesn't exist. Now it must have happened, but they don't address it. Either it was too painful for them to address it, or no one asked. But I find that hard to believe. But it's just not there. It's not there in the literature. So when we were sitting Shiva for Justin, some of my friends and colleagues who from the more traditional Jewish community in Detroit came to visit during Shiva, and one with whom I had a very good relation. He says almost smilingly. I remember the moment. He says, "So tell me, Norm, are you saying Kaddish?" And I said, "You bet I am. You bet I am." And he smiled. He said, "Good for you." Didn't tell me whether he thought it was right or wrong. Just he said that he validated it in a sense that was right. That was right for me. Okay, so one of Freehoff's famous responses is a man's mother died, but not the father. Now again, remember that traditionally you don't say Kaddish if your parents are still alive. But there's debate about if only one of them is still alive, And the majority opinion is that you you don't say Kaddish if the mother has died, but if and the father survives. But if the mother survives, then you do say Kaddish. I mean, there's a majority and minority opinion, but that's the traditional opinion. The son. So in this case, the question comes to Freehoff. The man's mother died, but not the father. The son wants to say Kaddish. He wants to say Kaddish for his mother, but the father, who is more traditional than the son, but the father objects. Don't you dare say Kaddish until I die, kind of thing. Um, so the question, a very very serious question to this family, to this rabbi, maybe even to the entire congregation. They approach in writing. They approached Freehoff. What would be your response? And Freehoff gives a very, very long answer, but he says it's very clear that the son may say Kaddish. In other words, the father is incorrect. It's based only on superstition. Now, we all know that there's certain power in superstition and myth and all that. But from the standpoint of Jewish practice and Jewish law, yes, the son may say Kaddish. And Freehoff goes on. He says by the 1700s in France, they actually have uh, uh, published words. Let's say there's no objection to anyone in a family saying Kaddish. Apparently, it was a referral to grandchildren who wanted to be able to say Kaddish for their grandparents. Uh, but it was expanded into a universal kind of thing. And then by the early 1800s, Freehoff gives this quote: "Those whose parents are alive should have no fears about saying Kaddish, reciting Kaddish." And he even expands it. Brothers can say for brothers, students can recite Kaddish for their teachers, and whatever. So he gives those kind of very practical, understanding, compassionate responses. And again, if we had more time or in a longer class, his are the most famous of his day, but the process continues. There is a responsum committee of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. It's chaired by one of the professors by the name of Mark Roshovsky. And they still publish, and I every once in a while I do a class and collect some of the most recent, of which there certainly have been plenty, relating to marriage ceremony, relating to who is a Jew, relating to Jewish identity, relating to sexual identity, relating to biomedical ethics, and things like that. Okay, I want to give a few words about this the reform world that Freehoff comes into. And Ruth Ann and I were joking about this, that we both remember, and some of the others of you might also, is back in the 40s and 50s. Well, she doesn't remember the 1940s, but okay, right. The 1950s and even into the 60s, it shifts pretty much after the Six-Day War, but up to the 1960s, those congregations, which were usually the main congregations, the main urban congregations, at least in the major metropolitan areas, were what we call classical reform. So, Ruth Ann, what they call Rodef Shalom in Pittsburgh when you were growing up? Saint Road. You're muted.
Sorry, I forgot I was muted. It was St. Rhoda's. Because also it was 2 blocks away from the Catholic cathedral. It was
Right.
across the street from the Catholic boys' school. It was 2 miles, a mile and a half, 2 miles away from the rest of the Jewish community.
Yep.
Yeah. It, yeah.
Right, right. So, again, because they were known to have the service was on Sunday. Okay, the music was in a mixed choir. Many of the soloists or the vocalists in the choir weren't even Jewish. They were paid to sing in the choir, and it was a concert. Um, the most of those temples were not necessarily known, even with nicknames like Saint Rudolph, but they were known by it. Was this was Freehoff's temple, this was Silver's temple, this was Bruckner's temple, this was Klein's temple. Whatever you didn't belong to the temple or the congregation, you belonged to the rabbi. And following that in those days. So and it develops out of Germany in the middle of the 19th century. And I just want to cite several of the reasons sociologically, historically, of why Reform Judaism as a particular movement. And again, I would make the case, and this is a longer discussion, I would make the case that Judaism has always been reforming, has always been changing, has always been adapting and modifying in light of societies society's change of mores and definitions and language and all of that. But Reform Judaism, that actually is referred to as classical Judaism, very far left, if you will, on a on a spectrum, not necessarily just political. Comes out, and these aren't in any particular order, but there are several, like I say, historical, sociological things that are going on. The first is that the Jewish world, the mainstream Jewish world, you had your Orthodox, and the Orthodox are broken up into the Hasidim and the Kabbalists and the Mitnagdim and the rationalists, and whatever. But most of the population, most of the population was itching for a new religious expression. Now, again, I would refer back to Rhinus's understanding of that they're looking for different ways to find religious responses to the circumstances in which they find themselves. What are those circumstances? The circumstances are that in the previous 50 to 80 years, look how many countries, look how many cultures had gone through periods of emancipation and liberation and independence. You had the French Revolution, you have the US Revolution, you have the uniting of all the German states, everything. It was a new world, with Jews being, for the most part, free citizens. They could vote. They could run for office. They could own property. This was all new for the Jewish world, both religiously and secularly. Secular scholarship, was giving new interpretations and new understanding of things that we take for granted when we study Torah. For example, we talk about, oh, there's the J source and the E source and the P source and the D source, and all those kinds of things. That was a brand new hypothesis that fell under the rubric of what they called Wissenschaft des Judentums, of scientific Judaism, critical understanding of the Bible and of texts, and people were encouraged to study this and to look at their religious background critically. So some people said, "Wow, this is all part of our newfound freedom," um, and others said, "You know what? This must mean that the Messiah is at hand. The Messiah is coming, because Jews can now be free. Jews can now be accepted, into the secular world and whatever. And if nothing else, the equality of the sexes, We can participate in the cultural world of the of the pub. We can go to the symphony. We can sing our songs. Let's take our uh, pardon me for doing this, but let's take our classical, traditional, um, lyrics from our hymns of praise to God and put them to songs and melodies that come from the secular world. Da dum 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 da dum. It's a German drinking song. Da dum 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 da dum 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 da dum dum dum. All right. So it was all part of this new world, as you will. I feel like I should branch into a Disney song, a brand new world. Da, 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 da. And that's what that was. So early classical reform begins with that understanding that people thought either they were so appreciative of now being full citizens or close to full citizens in their world, or that the Messiah was at hand. This a time of universal acceptance and brotherhood and sisterhood and freedom, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Um, then also, second sociological reality is that they needed change in light of the amount of Jewish immigration and assimilation. And there's a debate of it, if there were early criticism of Judaism as it came to the United States, the end of the 19th century into the beginning of the 20th century, is that it was Judaism light. Okay, Judaism light, and so there are those, and there are essays all over the place, and Freehoff is involved in this also. When you make your Jewish decisions, are you leading people towards more assimilation, or are you finding the fundamentals that must be protected so that there's not too much assimilation? And that's a balance. That's a tension that always plays out. And then there's the third, which was totally rejected by most of the rabbis, but a lot of this, not secular, what's the word that I'm looking for? A lot of the writing of lay leaders of of American Jewry into the let's say first 20 years, 30 years of the 20th century, is that this is the best way for us to this Judaism light, this kind of early Reform Judaism, is the best way for us to respond to anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism is indeed based on ignorance of who we are, let's not be so different. Everybody else celebrates Sabbath on Sunday, and here's the document that shows that it's okay to have our celebration on Sunday. Let's be like the Goyim. Let's be like them and not so different. Okay. Why do we have to have our prayers in a language? Forget the Catholics for a minute, because the Catholics were minority also, and they were having their services in Latin. But why can't we be like our Protestant neighbors and have all of their services in English, and have the Bible read in English, and have families sitting together? Remember, like it's Sunday morning, the family that prays together stays together, kind of thing. Why can't we be doing that? Why do we have to be so special or so different? Why do we have to wear different kinds of clothes? Why do everybody else takes their hat off to show respect to God? Why do we put our hats on? It just doesn't make sense. So there were those who were especially critical, saying, well, by being different, by claiming ourselves to be closer to God because of what we're doing, has increased anti-Semitism. Maybe if we try to be more like them, they'll understand us, they'll accept us better, and that will lead to a decrease in in anti-Semitism. So those were three. There were others, but those are three of the major um, uh, criticism, if you will, or explanations of why early Reform Judaism, especially in the United States or North America, was so far to the left. So much so that even at the 1915 celebration, when Solomon Freehoff was ordained as a rabbi, the menu at the luncheon included shrimp cocktail. Okay, so they went that far. Um, but again, there's the realization, and I hopefully don't have to prove it too much. The realization that Judaism has always been changing and always been reforming and adapting to the realities of the world. There are those examples we could give, and Freehoff's scholarship came about to affirm all that. So he cites that there are two major reforming revolutions, if you will, in our lifetimes, okay, or that stretch into our lifetimes. The first reforming revolution of Jewish history and Jewish practice and custom and ceremony and law was after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans. The temple in Jerusalem had been the center of observance. The priests and the Levites, they were at the center of everything, from worship to sacrifice to taxation. They ran it all. It's now no longer there. It's been destroyed. So the Jewish world suddenly needed to create an entirely different set of observances and practices and locations, people, places, and things. Okay, so that's what happened in the year 70, which Freehoff in his writing cites as the first reforming revolution of Jewish history. The second, he says, is more in our day, is the growth of diaspora communities that are as large as, if not larger, in his day. It's not so much the case anymore as the Holy Land, as the Promised Land, as Eretz Yisrael. So many of the laws, mitzvot as well as customs and traditions and ceremonies, were designed to be experienced in the land, in the Holy Land. They no longer could be observed. Again, Freehoff is writing most of this pre-1948, pre the State of Israel. Everything changed when Jews were no longer, the majority of the Jews were no longer living in the land, the Holy Land. Everything from the time that you would do something, to the season that you would do something, to the reasoning behind that you would do something. Recipes changed, clothing changes, harvests change. What you do, languages change. The one example that I always cite, because I did some research into it also, is a Jewish wedding. The mitzvah is the Jewish wedding supposed to take place outside, under the stars. Okay, chuppah was not a canopy. Okay, chuppah was something else, and the word kind of was appropriated in referring to the marriage ceremony. But a Jewish wedding was supposed to take place outside, because you're supposed to bless the bride and groom. The thought that they will have as many children, they will be as multiply and be fruitful as there are stars in the sky. So how are you going to do that if you're inside? You can't even see the sky. Okay, all right. So that was fine until Jews started to live in Minsk and Pinsk and Detroit and Chicago and Lansing and when New York and whatever, where you run the risk of not being able to have the wedding outside. So what do you do? Do you not have the wedding? Do you bring it inside? Do you put up a temporary cover to cover you from the rain? What do you do? Those are the kinds of questions that now the growth of a diaspora, as opposed to a religion that was based solely on on the land. But not only reforming and justifying change, but also to encourage creative and original and interpretive customs and ceremonies that reflect the needs, the wants, the expressions of a modern Jewish world. So I close with this quote from Freehoff, and again, it's one that I kind of remember, and I've used as a fundamental premise of my rabbinate and my teaching. And that's why I included in the Meet the Rabbis. So Freehoff says, the minhag created by the masses was the raw material which the law, meaning the halacha, took up, and then there's no period there, and then shifted and rearranged. Okay? The minhag, the custom that of Jewish tradition. That's Tevye's tradition. I don't know why we do it, but we do it. Okay, and it's been around so long that it has has the power of law. Example, keeping your head covered. The minhag created by the masses was the raw material which halacha took up and then shifted and rearranged. In other words, when you look carefully at most of the not the mitzvot, not God's commandment, but the halacha in the sense of religious practice of the individual Jew, most of that comes from you, from the people, not from us, the rabbis. You develop those minhagim, those customs, those responses, as opposed to the literature of responsa. But responses like Professor Reines was talking about, those responses that help you deal with the questions of life. They may be simple, they may be very complicated, but the minhagim, the ceremonies, the customs that you, the people, the Jews, have developed, okay, continue to be shifted and rearranged, reformed into a sanctified Jewish practice for our day. What makes sense, and many of us can remember that. Think back. I just was in a conversation with some colleagues about this the other day. Think back to what was important in our religious / Jewish lives 50, if you're old enough to do this, 50, 60 years ago. Some of that is now, it's pish posh, it doesn't mean anything, and some of them I can't even conceive that would be something that would have an impact on my religious life. Okay, so Ruth Ann was talking to us about the copyright laws and the YouTubes and things like that. Where does that fit into Jewish life? My son, the musician, says, Dad, every time that you're using one of those YouTubes and not paying for it, you're denying the musician part of the money that he or she should be getting for having created the music in the first place. Well, Judaism has a lot to say about the way that we treat our employees, and people who are looking for their livelihood, and dot 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 dot. So there may not have been YouTube, or there may not have been copyright laws, but there certainly were the general values, not only from the mitzvot, but from the way that our people approached their questions of life over the centuries, from which we can still learn and develop our 21st century Jewish identities. And I'm going to take a deep breath. Okay. And again, I have to be time conscious, but like a couple minutes if somebody has a question or challenge, or if I didn't do a very good job in explaining.
I was just thinking that the strength of Judaism really comes from the ability of the rabbis to listen to the people. In other words, the teacher learns from the students, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and because the destruction of the temple was when Judaism was a relatively, young religion, and we survived that particular trauma, that's an amazing adjustment. And I think somehow that's in the DNA of Judaism, to learn from a calamity somehow and to adjust.
And sadly, those calamities continue. So,
well, there is that,
right.
But
whether they're personal or communal, yes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, so you've now had Rabbi Eliezer Papo, you've had Solomon Freehoff. A month from now, I'm going to share with you some of the teaching, the story and teaching of Rabbi Leo Beck, and we'll be doing that or I think it's the evening of, or it's the day of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. Leo Beck was the spiritual leader of the German Jewish community of the Berlin Jewish community in the 1930s. He survived the war, came on to teach, and he has a lot to share with us about understanding the Holocaust, or at least putting the Holocaust into perspective, and also in light of that, what it means for Jewish-Christian relationships. One of his most famous books is entitled Judaism and Christianity. So Leo Beck will be a month from now, and then in 2 months, it will be almost exactly the weekend that marks the 50th anniversary of the ordination of Rabbi Sally Priesand, who grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, as did I. But that Sally was ordained as the first modern or contemporary woman to be ordained as a rabbi. So we celebrate that 50 years. So we'll talk about what has happened throughout the centuries, and especially in the last 50 years, in the role of women in the Jewish community. Okay.
It would be
Thanks, everybody.
really interesting.
Thank you.
It was very
Thank you.
interesting.
Ruth Ann, thanks for being our technology person.
Oh, okay. But I learned a lot. I just, never knew all this stuff. I mean, like I said, we, growing up, how I grew up, where I grew up, we totally discounted Road of Shalom. I mean, we didn't even consider them Jews, really.
Right. Well, in several, I don't know about Pittsburgh, but in Cleveland and Detroit, for example, there was originally just the one major classical reform congregation. They wound up, in both cases, I think this happened in Chicago too. They wound up splitting because of Zionism, over the issue of Zionism. Okay. So, that though, because who needed Zionism? Who needed Jerusalem in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, pre-war? Who needed Jerusalem when you had Cincinnati, or when you had New York? I mean, this is the promised land.
Yep.
This is the Golden Medina. We're not talking. Even the Orthodox have it in their prayer book that we want to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and reestablish the sacrificial cult and all that. And Reform Judaism, classical, said, no, we don't. No, we don't. We're quite happy here. But then, whether it was anticipation of what of the Holocaust, as Stephen Wise was prophesying, or whether it was for other reasons, but many of those classical reform, large urban, metropolitan congregations, urban congregations in the downtown, many of them wound up splitting over the Zionist issues. When I first went to Detroit in 1982. You were not allowed to have the Israel flag on the bima. You were not at a wedding. You were not allowed to smash a glass because that was reminiscent. That was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem being painful and being harmful to Judaism, and those things have changed, obviously. But that's only what is that? 40 years ago.
Mhm.
So, okay, got to run. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you,
See
everybody.
Thank you,
see soon.
Rabbi.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.